Hello everyone, this is Mr. O'Brien and welcome to the video quiz presentation on the Road to Revolution, 1761 to 1776. Alright, so let's get started. And the name of this slide is Rethinking Their Empire, and we're referring to England here. After the French and Indian War, i.e. the 7 Years' War, England was rethinking their empire, namely their New World Empire. Alright, so let's get started here. British government measures to prevent smuggling. Remember, the era of salutary neglect was ending towards the end of the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War. By 1761, they had taken measures to control smuggling, something called the Writs of Assistance. And to help me explain the Writs of Assistance, I will leave the PowerPoint for a moment and go to the notes underneath. Alright, so the Writs of Assistance, basically it gave England carte blanche, customs officers carte blanche, blank check, to search private property for smuggling, basically. And it was meant to enforce the Navigation Acts. It enraged the colonists, tensions increased, and it eventually leads to the Fourth Amendment, which we have today. But to explain the bullet points there about James Otis. James Otis was Advocate General in Massachusetts when the legality of these warrants was attacked, but promptly resigned his office when called upon to defend these writs of assistance. The Boston merchants then retained him as their lawyer to oppose the writs before the Superior Court of Massachusetts in 1761. Otis refused the fee they offered, saying that in such a case he despised all fees. In a 5-hour speech, I'm sure it was riveting for all 5 hours, which was witnessed by a young John Adams, Otis argued that the writs were unconstitutional. He based his case on the rights guaranteed in English common law. Well, he lost. Basically, the judge ruled that new parliamentary law, the writs of assistance, and the Navigation Acts had equal weight to past English law, English common law. Alright, so this was the beginning of the tension between the colonies and England. 1761, a couple of years before the 7 Years' War ended in 1763. Alright, so George Grenville's program, let me get my notes out over here. Okay. Alright, so George Grenville was the guy over in England in charge of generating revenue for England to maintain their empire. So first, we have the Sugar Act in 1764, and we have the Stamp Act in 1765. The Sugar Act, by the way, is also called the Molasses Act, because sugar and molasses somewhat synonymous back then. Alright, I'm reading from the notes underneath the PowerPoint. I don't have to leave the PowerPoint this time, because I actually have a printout of it for this particular slide. The experience and costs of the 7 Years' War led Great Britain, where King George assumed the throne in 1760, to consolidate its growing empire and make the colonists share in its costs. Hence the enforcement against smuggling, and they tried to actually collect the taxes. So before the war, the British had attempted to impose new trading regulations reinforcing the Navigation Acts, writs of assistance, which limited and controlled the colonist trade. In the 1740s, the Board of Trade, responsible for colonial affairs, had attempted to expand its influence over colonial governments, trying, for example, to bring colonial law into conformity with royal instructions. These new regulations failed in part because colonists simply ignored them. Without precedent, without it ever happening before, British rulers sought imperial reforms to make administration of the American colonies more efficient and systematic, and to raise funds to help pay for the war, which cost Britain far more than it did the colonies, and finance their empire. Remember, the British now had to keep redcoats after the war in the colonies. So it was to pay for the war that already happened, and the constant defense that the colonies would need, especially against Indians. To them, it seemed fair to force Americans to follow the Navigation Acts, the writs of assistance, help reduce the war debt, taxes, and pay for continued British protection. Furthermore, almost all Britons believed that Parliament represented the entire empire and rightfully legislated for it. Millions of Britons had no representatives in Parliament, but according to the theory of virtual representation, these Britons were constituents of each member of the Parliament. The duty of each was to represent the whole empire, not simply his district. So, in other words, What the colonists were arguing is, you can't tax us because we have no representation in Parliament. England's response was, you are represented virtually. Our empire goes worldwide. We have colonies all over the place. They're not represented. We even have districts in England itself where the people don't have a direct representative. Those in Parliament represent the empire as a whole. So colonies, the American colonies, you are represented virtually. Well, the colonists didn't buy that. Americans' argument that they could not be taxed without enjoying direct representation in Parliament did not find much support in Britain. In fact, eventually England did offer the colonies to have members in Parliament, and the colonies said no, because if that's the case, there would be an ocean between us, and they would no longer be one of us. The representatives would be one of you, not one of us. So in the early 1760s, British efforts to combat smuggling by issuing general search warrants, the writs of assistance, and its proclamation of 1763, barring further settlement on lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, like you learned last video quiz, sparked protests in the colonies. But this response was little compared to the colonists' outrage in 1764 and 1765 over new laws, including the Sugar, Revenue, and Currency Acts, measures which colonists believed infringed on their liberties and limited the profits they earned from previously less regulated trade. The Sugar Act alarmed colonists in part because it threatened the profits of colonial merchants already in economic trouble. Remember that. Moving on. If I can actually get this page turned. Alright, the Stamp Act crisis, 1765. Let's get all these bullets here. Alright, I am reading from the notes underneath the slide. Again, Stamp Act, 1765. The Stamp Act of 1765, however, was an unprecedented reform. It had never been this type of act. England had never tried before. The act directly taxed activities within the colony, instead of taxing imports and exports. So the difference was, especially in the eyes of the colonists, the desire of the aim of the tax was to generate revenue, not to just regulate trade. With the act, Parliament tried to raise money by requiring that all kinds of printed matter produced in the colonies, such as newspapers, books, and court documents, carry a stamp issued by authorities, hence the name the Stamp Act. In other words, any type of legal activity that involved paper product, you had to pay a tax, a deed to a home, so forth. And it had to get stamped. The stamp proved that you paid the tax. And the colonists' argument was that this is in fact what's called a direct tax, because it would be impossible to avoid this type of activity throughout your life. So they say, maybe not technically it is not a direct tax, but effectively it is, because you can't avoid the actions that are being taxed, such as a sales tax. You can avoid a sales tax by avoiding buying that particular product, but their argument was you can't avoid this particular act. This would raise funds for the stationing of British troops in the colonies without asking or forcing colonial assemblies to provide money. While previous regulations affected mostly those colonists directly involved in trade, the Stamp Act affected virtually every free colonist, many of whom resented a tax that interfered with the flow of information, was imposed without the consent of colonial governments, and paid for British troops whose presence many deemed an unnecessary intrusion. So 3 objections they had. Colonists opposing the tax viewed it as an infringement on their traditional English liberties, taking their property without consent, and they sometimes referred to these as their natural rights, as Englishmen. They also viewed it as a direct tax because, as I said, it was impossible to avoid these types of activities. Thus, it was tantamount to a tax directly on the people. It was the first direct tax imposed by England. In late 1765, the Stamp Act Congress, with delegates from most North American colonies, affirmed Americans' loyalty to Great Britain. They said, Britain, we're still loyal, but we insist upon our right to consent to taxation. You cannot tax us without representing us properly. Americans were beginning to see Parliament as no longer the safeguard of English liberty, but its principal enemy. The Stamp Act Congress insisted that the right to consent to taxation was essential to people's freedom. Remember that. Inspired by colonists in Boston who had protested the Sugar Act, colonial leaders formed committees of correspondence that communicated with each other and successfully coordinated efforts to prevent the Stamp Act's implementation. In cities such as New York and Boston, crowds often organized by the Sons of Liberty destroyed the stamps and forced those administering the laws to resign. The coercive activities of the Sons of Liberty, supported mostly by urban artisans, laborers, and sailors, frightened both imperial officers in the colonies and even colonial elites who opposed the Stamp Act but preferred orderly and peaceful protest. And here you see the class kind of tension between the more elite rebels, like John Adams, who wanted a more proper type of rebelling against this, and the common person, the urban artisan, the middling folk, who seemed to them, to the elite, to be less controlled, more unruly. So it was kind of a conundrum, a pickle. These elite will eventually need to mobilize the masses to help defeat England, but they also want to maintain, they want to run the government after the war is over. Will that come back to haunt us? In other words, the elite colonists disapproved of the mob actions of the masses. Though the Americans' resistance and pressure from London merchants and manufacturers afraid of losing markets led the Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act in 1766, Parliament simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, which affirmed that Parliament had the authority and power to pass laws in the future that affected the colonies, including new taxes. In other words, England rejected Americans' claims that only their elected representatives could levy taxes. So, England basically said, we're going to repeal the Stamp Act, but you know what? We're still in charge, and we don't buy your argument that we can't tax you. Alright, let's move on. Ooh, I forgot to hit that last bullet. Townshend duties, 1767. It basically imposed new import duties on lots of things like glass and tea. It unwittingly encouraged even more colonists to boycott British goods. Meaning that wasn't its intention, but it did. It led to an even bigger boycott. And these Townshend duties created a board of commissioners to catch smugglers. And they were supposed to use the tax to raise revenue to pay the salaries of American governors and judges. So I'm reading from the notes underneath. In 1767, the British government imposed a new set of taxes on the American colonies, designed by Charles Townshend, the government's chief financial minister. Taking at their word American statements that they did not object to taxes on trade, the Townshend duties taxed goods imported into the colonies and established a new board of customs commissioners to collect the taxes, suppress smuggling, and to raise funds to free judges and governors from their financial dependence on colonial assemblies. In other words, people voted for local assemblies, and those local assemblies paid the salaries of the local judges. And England was trying to sever that relationship. Because, think about it, the judges were dependent on the local assemblies for their salaries. There was, in England's view, that was a conflict of interest. So, although American merchants opposed the duties, the colonial opposition developed more slowly compared to the response to the Stamp Act. So let's look at the colonial response. Alright, first we got John Dickinson in 1768, and he wrote in a pretty well-known pamphlet, Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, objecting to these Townshend duties. Again, he was objecting to the fact that the purpose of the tax was to raise revenue, not to regulate trade. 1768, we have a second non-importation movement, and there's the idea of the Daughters of Liberty came about in this time, and we'll talk about it on the bottom here. So let me read from beneath the slide. A colonial boycott on imported British goods developed in Boston and spread to the southern colonies, where many southern planters hoped to use the boycott to reduce their debt to British merchants. Boycotters celebrated the virtue of American resistance and denigrated the luxury of British society by producing their own homespun clothing, Daughters of Liberty. Although urban artisans welcomed an end to competition from British imports and strongly supported non-importation, urban merchants were at first reluctant to honor the boycott, and in some cities, extra-legal committees and crowds attempted to enforce it. So, the Daughters of Liberty was the name given to women who spun and wove to create their own clothing rather than buy British goods.